you doing, folks? My name is Nathaniel Sawyer. As a lot of you know, I'm a Black Lives Matter activist here on Monterey County Peninsula. I am honored and blessed to have Congressman Jimmy Panetta here to talk to me about possibly get into systemic racism, African-American issues. We're just gonna have an authentic, just real conversation. Sometimes we may not just throw a policy out there, but just our opinions of what should be and what could be. But before that, Jimmy, could you introduce yourself? Like, I feel like, obviously you've been around for a long time, but for the people that don't know you, give them a little bit about you and about being a congressman as well.
Yeah, sure, man. I appreciate that, Nate, and thank you for this opportunity. But let me just digress before I get in myself. Let me thank you. Thank you for what you do. Obviously, coming here into this community, we appreciate everything that you're doing to lead on these issues. And these aren't just easy issues. You're leaning into some tough issues here. And let me tell you, we appreciate it. And that's why I appreciate this time having these types of conversations in which we can hopefully talk about some tough issues, but also educate people about these tough issues as well, and kind of give them an idea of what you said. I mean, there's a lot of words, but we got to turn our words into deeds is what it comes down to, and how we can get there. And so I really appreciate your leadership on these issues. I appreciate you, like I said, leaning into our community and being a part of our community and basically moving us forward together when it comes to something as important as Black Lives Matter, when it comes to something as important as democratic politics, especially with November 3rd around the way. And I can tell you what I think we'll come to the conclusion of at the end of this conversation is that those are tied together, to be frank. And there's some actions there that we can take together when it comes to making sure that everybody participates in our democracy. Yes, by being out there and having our voices heard, but also walking right into the voting booth as well, which is so important. So to answer your question, I'm Jimmy Panetta. I am the U.S. representative for the Central Coast of California in the 20th Congressional District. So this is an area that encompasses all of Monterey County, all of San Benito County, a majority of Santa Cruz County, and then just a sliver of Santa Clara County going up into Gilroy. So just a little bit of that. And it's my home. I grew up here. I was educated here. I worked here, and then had the fortunate opportunity to representing this place that I've always called home, that we call home. Obviously, as you know, being a representative now can be quite interesting. But I got to tell you, being a representative of this area, there's a lot of diversity here, which we are so proud of in so many ways. Obviously, geographically, we not only have a lot of beauty that we know out here on the peninsula and up in Santa Cruz, but we have a lot of bounty in the sense that our #1 industry is agriculture, and that takes up a big part of this district. And it's by far the #1 in our economy, #1 producer in our economy. And so it's making sure that obviously we balance those interests from our economy to our environment. And I think we do a good job of that here. And people in both aspects actually realize and appreciate how they can play off each other. We don't work against each other. We actually work with each other in a lot of ways in going forward and realizing that diversity, not just geographically, but politically as well. And socioeconomically as well. So, I believe that, being from this district has basically prepared me pretty well for my work in Washington, D.C., in dealing with all the differences that come out that are so apparent within our country. But it's something I enjoy doing, but obviously it's the service to the people here on the Central Coast, which is the best part of it, and giving back to this place that I've always called home. And I think you understand that part about service and stepping up and stepping into it and going and stepping forward. And so that's what I admire about you. And I've been nothing but honored to be here and to work with you as we have in the past, and continue working with you as we go forward, especially on these tough issues like equality as well.
Thank you, Jimmy. You mentioned something very important earlier. You talked about the division, or how we're trying to bring people together instead of separate. Well, do you believe U.S. citizens are more polarized and divided than ever before? Pew Research did a study that said, I have to look at my notes really quick. We are more divided than we have ever been in history. We are less likely to compromise, and we make decisions without research based off our own beliefs. Pew Research also says it's due to technology. What do you think about that? Before we get into deep into systemic racism, division has to be talked about.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I believe that there is a lot of division in our country. I mean, we are, first of all, we're diverse in a lot of ways. And you can use our diversity against us, or you can use our diversity for us, in the sense that our strength, as we always know, is through our diversity. And what we have to realize is that it doesn't mean that we lose our individual identity. And what I like to believe is that our country is basically a network of a number of ideas, a number of differing ideas and differing philosophies that we've been able to sort of keep together based on who we are and what we stand for, and making sure that this everlasting American experiment always gets better and more inclusive. And obviously there are people, as we know well, who don't look at it that way, unfortunately, and use our diversity against us and try to separate us rather than bringing us together. And because we're so diverse, that can be easy to do. And because we're so diverse, you can see people in prominent positions getting elected based on that unfortunate rhetoric. But that happens, though, when you have people who don't participate in our democratic process. And so being in Congress, I get exposed to people from all over this country, representatives from all over this country. It's actually one of the best parts about being in Congress are the people I work with. And don't get me wrong, there are polarizing people on both sides of the spectrum. But I can tell you there are more people in Washington, D.C. that their constituents tell them they want us to work together. They want us to get things done together. And they realize that our democracy is not something that happens overnight. And legislation is not something that happens overnight. Legislation is a grind. It's a long process where you got to sit down and you got to understand all angles. And yes, it does take a lot of effort to come to that compromise. It's not easy. It's really not easy, but I'm telling you, it can happen. I actually saw it happen this past year when we worked hard to work on something that is very polarizing, and actually something that this president has used to continue to polarize this country, and that's immigration reform. We remember when he came down that golden escalator in that golden building, and the first thing he did was scapegoat Latinx and Mexicans and the horrible things he said. But actually in Washington, D.C., I can tell you there's Democrats and Republicans who understand how important immigrants are to the fabric of this country and who we are. And I tell you, Democrats and Republicans sat at the table for about 8 months, grinding out the details on this legislation and actually coming up with a bill, not a perfect bill, but a compromise bill that was a damn good bill, in which we had Democrats, Republicans, farmers, and farm workers at the table. And that bill passed in Congress with a bipartisan number of votes. The first time in a decade that we've had, and more than that actually, that you've had a vote on immigration reform pass on a bipartisan basis out of Congress. And I was proud to be one of the lead authors of that bill. But it can't happen. It takes a lot of work, but damn it, our country is worth it, because we're not there to find our differences. That's too easy. We know we have to find our similarities, and that's how our country moves forward. So yes, of course, we're polarized, but I can tell you, I see the good, and most people should see the good, and what happens when we actually come together for a common purpose for the good to move things forward. And that's what I hope to do in Congress.
Yes, sir, you already have been doing that. You're already talking about how you're pushing bipartisan humanitarian policies. And something that I'm thinking about as you're speaking is that a lot of people say this: we have a lot of bad apples. Where I'm tired of hearing that statement, maybe we should look at the root and start there. And if the root is bad, take it out and put it and plant something there that is not going, where people can't say, well, there's more bad apples and X, Y, and Z. Activists have been asking for policies to combat systemic racism and bring equity and equality to our surrounding areas here on the Monterey Peninsula and worldwide, honestly, all over the place. Black Lives Matter has not just become a United States Estados Unidos thing, it's become everywhere else. People rising up for their own oppression and policies based off of the African-American suffrage that we are tired of hearing. What have been the barriers for policies when it comes to combating systemic racism? People love to use education as Robitussin. My mom back in the day used to give me Robitussin for everything. If I was sick, Robitussin. If I failed, Robitussin. I'm making a joke, people, but seriously though, we love to say education is the key to combating systemic racism. And something I was thinking about, and I was talking to some of my elders in the African-American community here, was that, you know, there's a lot of educated people out there that can't leave the racism at the door. So what are the policies that, or what is something that we can do that eradicates systemic racism at its core?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing it is that people have to realize that that's an issue. Okay, now look, I think when it comes to systemic racism, and when you say that, it sure as hell doesn't mean that everybody's racist in the system. And that's the message that I believe we have to get across a little bit more, in the sense that if we're going to talk about it, let's make it clear. Everybody, when you say systemic racism, it doesn't mean that people are racist. But what it does mean is that the system, based on our history, can operate in a racially biased manner, regardless of individual motives, okay? And you have to understand that the way I believe we need to talk about this is look at the data, man. You have to look at the data. And given the vast racial disparities, as well as the data, to me, it's clear. When you look at the data, there is systemic racism that is prevalent here in the United States. And just let me kind of give you some stats, okay? I'm not just saying it. Let's talk about the stats. African Americans in the United States earn 3/5 as much, and as white Americans. In England, they earn 90% as much. Household income, African Americans, 42,000. White Americans, 70,000. 35% of young Black men are unemployed, 2 times that of whites. Median net worth, 17,000 for African Americans versus 171,000. Borrowing 3,000 in an emergency, African Americans, 43% of them are able to do that. White Americans, 71% are able to do that. And then let's look at COVID. And let's look at what we're dealing with this pandemic. I mean, if you're poor, if you're Black, if you're Latinx, if you're Asian American, if you're Pacific Islander or Indigenous, you know that you're at much greater risk from this virus. Black people are dying at 2.5 times the rate of white people in the US. Indigenous and Latinx people are both 50% more likely to die from COVID than white Americans. And so how do we deal? And I wanted to lay that data out there to basically show that when you look at the data and when you look at the disparities, it's there, okay? It's there. So how do we deal with this? Well, look, let's look at our response when it comes to obviously the pandemic and what we have been doing to make sure that communities of color are basically taken care of. And it's making sure that there are the bills that are passed that actually highlight that to solve that, to take care of that. And so when it comes to, let's say, like the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, when we passed that in the CARES Act, basically, we had to get money out the door, but what we're realizing is that minority businesses were being left out because they didn't have the relationships with these loan banks or loan agents. They just didn't have those relationships. So what we did is we passed a subsequent bill. We learned from our mistakes, passed a subsequent bill that basically increased the amount of PPP, but said a certain amount of that only goes to populations of color who own businesses. And so it's those types of areas that you can start to think about in policies based on the data. forward, looking at, obviously, and we'll probably get into this, the Justice and Policing Act, what we did to pass that to basically revamp the legal standards, just kind of simply to sum it up, revamp the legal standards when it comes to prosecuting police misconduct, creating a database to track police misconduct, and refocusing police on making sure they use de-escalation of force rather than the escalation of force. And then let's go forward and look what can happen next year. If we have an administration that's willing to do something about this, if we have a Senate that's willing to do something about this. I'm on the Ways and Means Committee. Ways and Means Committee deals with something that's very important to everybody's lives, and that's our taxes, okay? So we're gonna be on the front line of readjusting our tax structure, making sure that we look at the 2017 tax bill that passed and only benefited the upper echelon of our society, and make sure that people who make over 400,000 pay their fair share. But also let's look at the earned income tax credit. Make sure that there's a way that people who have low incomes in this country get the benefits of having increased tax refunds because of their low income, to give them that extra hand. Let's look at the child tax credits, the CTC. Make sure that people who have kids can get a bigger tax credit. Let's look at bringing back the first-time home buyers tax refund as well. That's something that I got when we bought our first home back in 2003, but they canceled that after, I think it was 2010. Let's look at putting that back. When it comes to our renters, we know how expensive it is here to live on the Monterey Peninsula on the central coast of California. Let's look at a way that if anybody's paying more than a third of their income towards rent and towards their housing, then that anything above that, they should get a tax deduction for that. Now, these are all things that we're already talking about in Congress. Let's look at something like a baby bond, okay? Something that provides, a baby bond is something that provides every child in the United States of America with $1,000 in a bank account. And that $1,000 can accrue interest all the way up to that child's 18, and that child can use it once they turn 18 for school, for other progressive purposes. When I say progressive, productive purposes, going to a vocational academy or something of that nature. And that's why it's across the board. Everybody gets that. Make sure that we basically are able to, like I said, flatten the playing field so that everybody has that opportunity, which we talk about so much here, being the land of opportunity. Let's make sure that everybody has that chance for that opportunity. So sorry for going on long, but that was a big question with a lot to answer, from the pandemic, from the data, from equality, from policing, and from what I'm looking forward to working on in this next term in Congress, if I get reelected, is dealing with our tax base and making sure it's readjusted so that it's fair for everybody.
I appreciate you giving us a package, of things that you're already doing, but also there's things that we should work more on. Like, honestly, to go back to your data on African Americans, to give the audience more of a realistic view of someone. Yes, I'm talking to Jimmy Panetta now, and I've talked to senators and other people like that, but I'm an African American who was a graduate student with a lot of loan debt, first in my family to graduate high school. And I am currently, sadly, unemployed. I don't want to get into it too much, but there was just a little bit of systemic racism that was involved. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because Jimmy's facts of what he just said, now you're putting a face to it. I am someone who was homeless at one point in undergraduate school because, again, I was the first in my family to graduate high school. So obviously they weren't going to be able to afford to help me in undergraduate school and that through the financial aid process or anything like that. That was all new territory. I'm here in Monterey County Peninsula right now. And I've been here for a while, and I've gotten to know a lot of amazing folks. And everyone continues to ask this question about at-will employment here in California. African Americans believe at-will employment can be a weapon used by systemic racism. How do we make sure those leading more diverse staff and are held accountable if they use the law as a tool of their discrimination, racism, and microaggression, sexism, and bigotry, and put them all in the category? Although it may be retaliation, at-will employment gives some employers power to abuse the law. As a person who is in the Democratic Party, an activist, and I'm wanting to go after my PhD after my master's, I'm a target. I mean, it is what it is. I'm an educated African-American man who's unapologetic at times and just says what he believes is true. And there's people that do not leave their racism at the door, who are in leadership's power. And most of the time it's white men or women when it comes to an African American man or woman. And so I have to be real. When I go back to the education thing, I'm as educated as I probably want to be, but I feel like I have to continue to climb and reach more education, because I will always have someone who may feel like I'm a threat. You've probably been attacked as a congressman by the Republican Party constituents probably a lot over the years, and I've had a little taste of that doing the Black Lives Matter thing in the streets, where I've had Republican members call jobs that are a volunteer position where I've been, and they've said nasty things about me, and it's really sad, because as soon as I met some of them in person, they loved me, because they got to know me. So it's sometimes it's a systemic racism, but it's also ignorance. But ignorance is okay. Willful ignorance is the problem. And a lot of our policies have, sadly, that maybe a psychologist needs to be in the room when politicians are talking, because there's some, I'm just being honest, there's some kind of mental gap between what's right and what's wrong. And I may believe the way I believe, but if it's going to hurt someone else's household, then I shouldn't say it, or I shouldn't put it out there.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I think there's I failed to tie this in one of your last questions, but I think you're right in the sense that, that the internet and social media, and what you said, when you actually look somebody in the eye and you get to know them, that's a bridge that is irreplaceable. And it's tough these days using Zoom and our phones and being social distance and having to stay at home and shelter in and hunker down, because we're losing that to a certain extent. And you have to make certain steps in different directions and adapt, like we're doing with this via Zoom, to make sure that we continue to maintain that type of interaction. Because like you said, once you get to know somebody, once you look them in the eye, first of all, it makes it a lot harder to demean somebody when you can look them in the eye. You can't just press send and go hide behind your computer. You actually got to be able to defend and talk about why you actually said something like that. But second, I think it's our human nature. More importantly, I think it's our human nature. I mean, and I can tell you, I know you like people, you get along with people. You're a people person. That's why you're out there doing your thing. And so am I. And that's one of the great things about this job, is it's all about people. And I think that's very important that we maintain that type of interaction. Now, look, I think when it comes to obviously employer and employee relationships, it gets back to making sure that, basically employees continue to retain the power that we fought for so long. I mean, we have to make sure that our unions continue to have that power and give them more power when it comes to worker protection and worker protection laws, to ensure that our employees are protected but more importantly, have access to justice when they're not. Now, earlier this year, we passed what was called the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. And what that did is it amended labor laws to give workers more power during disputes at work, like you talked about. Allow workers to sue employers who illegally interfere with unionizing efforts, instead of forcing them to take all of their complaints to the National Labor Relations Board. It adds penalties for companies that retaliate against workers who organized. It grants workers collective bargaining rights that they don't currently have. And it weakens right to work laws in 27 states that allow employees to forego participating and paying dues in unions, because we know how important our unions are. And I think it's basically making sure that on top of looking at other policies like improving how our country and employers deal with workplace harassment, prevention, and remediation. And some of the things that we're looking at is that we'll probably be acting on next year if things go accordingly with our vote in the presidency and in the Senate, is strengthening existing civil rights and workplace protections that address all forms of discrimination and harassment, expanding legal protections against harassment and discrimination to all working people, including guest workers, gig workers, and low-income professions, eliminating binding arbitration clauses to resolve employment discrimination and harassment claims, eliminate barriers to accessing justice by extending the statute of limitations when one can file a harassment or other discrimination claim with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Hey, Jimmy, we only have
Things like that. Yeah, you bet. No, but things like that is what we're looking at. And I think that goes to your question about how we can make sure that there isn't discrimination, especially in the workplace.
No, I love it.
Sorry.
You always come with you come with it. That's one thing about you. You're not just gonna talk. You're gonna say what's happening and what's gonna happen. And I love that about you. I have two more questions to ask you. And honestly, you brought it up a little bit, you touched on it earlier, but how do we combat the school to prison pipeline? We can talk about decriminalizing law enforcement all day. Everyone talks about it. But our children who continue going to the juvenile justice system, who eventually become as a person who's a corrections officer and now a Black Lives Matter leader, and worked in the foster care system, I've seen it where a child goes from the foster care system or some type of institution to jail and then eventually prison. And it's based off of that assimilation and only things that all they know. They're getting a PhD in being a career criminal instead of getting one in the educational system. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, that question is a multifaceted question, as you started to hit on in what you just said. And therefore, it's going to take all levels of government and action when it comes to making sure that you have certain communities and certain students that don't just, go right into county juvenile hall and county jails in our prisons. And look, I think I'm gonna, because it's such a big question, I'm going to keep it to my responsibility as a federal legislator. And let me just kind of highlight something that we did. And let me just tell you, we passed actually on a bipartisan basis this thing called the First Step Act. Okay. Now, look, I know that this is something that President Trump touts, but the only reason President Trump touts is because we basically laid the foundation in Congress to pass this. And to be frank, we got Jared Kushner to basically believe in it. And he understood that and actually passed this. And what it did is basically for those who are in prison, it gave them good time credit fixed. It was put into place a risk reduction system in our prisons to prevent recidivism. It gave more resources for those who do commit recidivist crimes. It paroled people closer to home. So like some go to prison, just get let out of prison in other parts of the state, and then they're kind of stuck there. No, we parole them, make sure they go home to their area where they have that support system. Make sure that the prisoners who are pregnant, which can happen, make sure they're taken care of, make sure people get their IDs right upon release, and do a compassionate release for those in prison like we have been seeing done, especially with this pandemic, and more needs to be done with that. And then passed overwhelmingly in Congress, 360 to 59 in a bipartisan basis. And then, of course, there's the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which, like I said, not just focuses on policing, but make sure that other local agencies look outside the box when it comes to using force, looks outside the box when it comes to different sorts of policing. It's not defunding the police. It's not just about law and order. What it is about something that I always try to uphold as a former prosecutor. It's about justice. It's about making sure it works fair for everybody. And I think that's an important part. We lose aspect of it and starting to get into these slogans, unfortunately. It's not about slogans, it's about substance. And I can tell you in Congress, we are talking about substance and making sure that we stop that sort of, as you said, that school to prison pipeline and doing our job, at least at the federal angle. But as you know, Nate, there's a lot more that can go into that answer for that tough question.
Jimmy, thank you so much. I'm not a congressman. I'm just a guy studying policy right now. But I always tell people, I'm 27, but I'm not 50. I still have a long way to go and learn a lot when it comes to what you're doing right now. Do you have any wisdom and love to give after your tenure as a public servant? You've been doing it for a long time. We're in the COVID-19 pandemic. Black Lives Matter. Latinx brothers and sisters are out there fighting as well. Can you give us some words, just some positivity? Because I feel like so many people are hurting right now.
Yeah, no, look, I think people need to understand, especially here on the Central Coast. And what we got here is a good thing, and that people who are in public office, people who are out there advocating for other people's issues like yourself, We understand right now we have to make government work for people, okay? Now more than ever, with the pandemic, with the economic shutdowns, with the fights for equality, with the wildfires that we've experiencing, and yes, with this election coming up. And that means that yes, government has to work, but people have to participate as well, man. And I can't stress that enough, because a lot of the bills I talked about, the reason why some of them aren't going forward, why is because they're stuck in the Senate. Well, why are they stuck in the Senate? Because there's electeds from other parts of this country that aren't basically advocating for those bills. Well, let's make sure that those constituents hold their electeds accountable. If those electeds aren't putting forward those types of bills that will help us in immigration, help us in public safety, help us when it comes to equality, then they need to be held accountable. How are we going to hold them accountable? Like I said, not just marching, but marching right into that voting booth. I cannot stress that enough. We need to make sure we vote and vote early. And when we participate, man, that is how our democracy goes forward. Our history of our country has shown that. And that's when it comes down to all of us together, making sure we live up to our obligation to participate in this democracy. That's how we go forward. I can't stress that enough, Nate. You know that.
Oh, thank you. And honestly, trust me, we're marching to the voting booths. We did it a couple of days ago. I have a video of it where it was beautiful in Monterey. We're going to continue to do it. And seeing you put your ballot in the mailbox as well inspired a lot of people also. So continue to do what you do. I look forward to seeing you when I see you on the streets, or just, us being activists out there. And, I'm so honored to know you, and I look up to you. You're an icon. I stand on the backs of people like you. I don't know where my life is going to go in the future, but I do know right now this means a lot to me as an African American man who comes where I come from and is talking about things that matter to me.
Now, you listen. We stand shoulder to shoulder. That means we're going to go toe to toe with the issues we need to go on. So we're going to work together on this one. Like I said, shoulder to shoulder, so we can go toe to toe.
All right, I'm gonna let you go, and thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you.